So, today I want to talk to you a little bit about foliage. Plants, the kind of trees, grass, all of that stuff. Because again, like everything else, modeling it requires some understanding of what it is and how it works. So, basic anatomy of a plant looks something like this. You have the root, and that root goes out into your main taproot, which is the one that goes down, and then the lateral roots come off from it. This is how the structure, it's the foundation of the plant. It keeps it in the ground, keeps you from getting pulled over or falling out in a strong wind, but it also helps them pull nutrients they need from the ground. Into that, the stem emerges running up the center. So when we talk about this, in a tree, this would be a trunk. In the case of this plant, this would be a stem. Off of these stems, we get the actual shoots that go and terminate into individual leaves, and the leaves themselves have their own structure to them, a little center stem, and then the whole blade of the leaf coming off. There's also buds, which tends to be new growth, and those will turn into leaves, as well as buds that are reproductive, like flowers. So whether we're talking about a bush or a fern or a tree or even grass, they're all having more or less a similar structure to this one right here. One of the things that's important to understand when we're working with plants and trees, often I see students and they just want to throw a bunch of trees in there. And they say that's more than enough, but there's actually a lot of layers and structure. And there's a hierarchy to it, and that's something to understand. This is a good example of a sort of tree canopy that you might find in, say, like a jungle. So the top layer is the canopy. That's what, if you look at it from an airplane, everything you see on top. Now the trees on top tend to grow as high as they can to get as many nutrients as possible. The tighter the trees are packed in together, the less they tend to grow out and the more they tend to grow up. So this is like a conifer forest or like jungle versus if you see a deciduous forest, the trees maybe are more spread out from each other and they tend to build that leafy big opening because they can support all those leaves. Leaves function a little bit like solar panels. They take that solar light, they convert it into energy to help them survive and get the nutrients they need. Right under the canopy is the next layer of trees, the trees that are kind of on their way up. They're not as old as the top trees of the canopy, but they're rising up, and usually they find little gaps where they can get enough sunlight to keep growing, to keep larging and keep increasing in their size. Below this, so our canopy layer and then our understory right here, we get down into more of our shrub layer. This is where like young trees that are just starting to grow up might come out, as well as things like tall flowering bushes and stuff like that. Because a bush can be something really small or it can actually be fairly large. The big difference about a bush is instead of like a traditional tree, which has a trunk and then shoots off of it, a bush instead has a crown where all of the shoots come from the ground level right from the root. It doesn't have like a trunk, it just shoots off from the bottom. This is somewhere between 1.5 to 5 meters overall in height. And like I said, it's usually either new tree growth and or established bushes and shrubberies. Then we get down to what's called the herb layer or the herb layer or however you pronounce it. This is usually much shorter. This is like grass tends to be here. And this grass can be really tall. We think about grass as lawns, but grass can be taller than me, taller than human height. Like if you look at grasslands, they tend to be very tall. And these are things that you're going to find young shrubs. You're going to find ferns down here. You're going to find flowers and other kind of plants. This also you're going to find like rooting plants and vegetables. Berries grow at this level. Like a lot of that lower kind of tiered stuff that's kind of lower to the ground. You can think of it as like an underbrush. You tend to trot over it as you walk through a forest. And then on the bottom layer, we have the forest floor. This is where we have the absolute lowest level. Moss, algae, but this is also where you have like dead leaves and twigs that are going to die, decompose, and turn back into nutrient-rich soil, help everything else continue to grow. Below that, you do have an actual root layer, there's other fungal layers, and there's a lot of stuff happening below ground, but for us, it's these 4 layers we're really concerned with. This forest floor, and then our herb layer, our shrub layer, and then our tree or canopy layer. And so having some idea, you can see it's almost like each time it goes half the size as it works its way down. So as we're building these environments, we want to think about how they're layered together, how they integrate, because that's how we're going to create the best realism. So grass has a lot of forms, everything from grasslands to well-manicured lawns used in sporting events. It has its own shoots and its own leaves, and it does have little florets and flowerings. Now, the kind of grass we're used to seeing is pretty much just a leaf and a straight shoot up. So it's got a little root in the ground, and then it shoots straight off by itself. Ground cover, which is the next layer up, sort of that herb layer, we tend to see a lot of these types of plants. Ferns, this is a classic Boston fern. A fern is actually simpler than a lot of the flowering plants that you see down here. They have a lot less root structure, they're a lot less complicated, and they tend to have these just big leafy vegetation that helps them get most of their nutrients from the air and atmosphere, as opposed to necessarily pulling as much of it out of the soil. So these are your next kind of layer of cover. Low to the ground, relatively small leaves. Moving up to shrubs and bushes, this is where you get things like cactuses and even large flowering bushes like this. As I mentioned, you still have the same structure, but instead of a trunk like you would have on a tree, we have a crown. And then it still drills down into the roots, but we see the individual shoots coming out. In this case, they call it a cane, before it turns into branches. And that gives us this overall structure. That's what makes a bush sort of have all of its leafy vegetation low to the ground, whereas the tree has all of its leafy vegetation higher up in the air. When you get to trees, there's two major types we need to think about: conifer trees and deciduous trees. So conifers are often called softwoods, and deciduous trees are often called hardwoods, even though there are some types of conifers that's wood is very hard and some types of deciduous trees that are very soft. It's just a convention. Sometimes you'll hear hardwood versus softwood. Conifers, they don't have leaves, they have nettles or needles. They also usually have pine cones or some kind of method of spreading themselves out that way. They tend to be very rugged and very hardy. They can grow very fast or very slow. So pine is often used in construction because it's strong, but it's a very, very fast growing. Spruce is a very fast growing type of tree, so it can be replaced very quickly. Versus a deciduous tree tends to be slower growing. These are things like oaks and maples and elms. And they have a similar structure of large permanent roots and a single trunk that the branches start coming out after a certain length. So whether it's a conifer or a deciduous tree, there's a certain height that we get to before the branches start coming out. And then the branches split multiple times, and it forms overall what we're going to call a crown. Sometimes these trees are called conifers, and sort of thought about this because of their actual term that doesn't mean, even though they're often cone shaped, it actually refers to like the pine cones and the way they distribute their seeds that way. There is, in a lot of these, although some spruces and other breeds of conifers can have a round, more bulbous shape, a lot of them have this overall sort of profile of a conic shape, whereas deciduous trees tend to shoot up and have this bulb, this crown, or a mass of branches. And this overall shape is something we want to think about when we're trying to simplify the concept of a tree. Because when we're doing things in CG, there are just millions of leaves to render in a scene like this, way more than we can handle. So the question is always going to be, not only would it take too much time to do all that by hand, but it also would be too hard for the computer to render every individual leaf by itself. So with that, I'll show you some of the tricks we use to actually generate some of these trees.